If you were a British boy in the 1950s, a Hornby Dublo set was the finest thing you ever unwrapped on Christmas morning. The oval of track around the tree, the heavy engine warm in your hand. At its peak, Hornby Dublo was the finest table railway in the world, built by hand in a Liverpool factory that employed 2,000 people and sold trains across the empire. Meccano had survived everything. The First War, when the works turned to munitions. The Depression, the Blitz, which flattened the streets around it and left the factory standing. A metal shortage after the war that should have crippled it. It came through all of it. And then, after more than 70 years, the great Liverpool works fell silent, and Hornby, the real Hornby, was gone. How does a company that survived 2 world wars and made the finest trains on earth simply vanish? That's what this is about. Chapter 1. The Shed on Copperer's Hill. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with a man who had no business succeeding at it. In the last year of the 19th century, in a corner of Liverpool, a bookkeeper in his late 30s spent his evenings in a garden shed, bending offcuts of sheet metal into toys for his 2 small sons. His name was Frank Hornby. He had left school at 16. He had no training as an engineer, no capital to speak of, and no earthly reason to believe that the bits of tin he was shaping into cranes and lorries and little bridges would ever amount to anything at all. Hornby was born on the 15th of May, 1863, at 77 Copperer's Hill, the son of a provision merchant. He'd gone straight from the schoolroom into his father's business as a cashier. He'd married a schoolteacher, Clara Walker Godfroy, in 1887. And he'd settled into the ordinary, respectable life of a Victorian clerk. A wage, a family, a modest house, the whole predictable shape of it. Then his father's business closed. Somewhere around the turn of the century, and Hornby found himself keeping the books for a man called David Hugh Elliot, who imported meat into Liverpool. It was not the trajectory of a man about to change the world, but Hornby had read a book. He'd read it, by his own account, over and over. Samuel Smiles's Self-Help, that great Victorian sermon on the idea that any man, through diligence and ingenuity, could lift himself clean out of his circumstances. Hornby believed it completely, and in that shed, making toys for his boys Roland and Douglas, he arrived at the single idea that would carry him out of the ledgers for good. What if the metal strips didn't have to be cut to fit each toy? What if every strip was punched with holes at regular intervals, so that the same handful of pieces could be bolted together to build anything at all, taken apart again, and rebuilt into something entirely new? It was such a simple idea that its simplicity was nearly the problem, and it landed in a market that badly needed it. This was an age when the British nursery was ruled by German toys, beautifully made tinplate from Nuremberg, imported by the trainload, against which British manufacturers scarcely competed at all. Hornby's invention was, in its quiet way, a British answer to all that. A toy that taught engineering while pretending to be play. But he had no money to develop it, and no name that any shopkeeper would trust. So he went to his employer, and Elliot lent him £5. £5. On the 9th of January, 1901, Frank Hornby filed his patent under a title of magnificent Victorian dullness: Improvements in Toy or Educational Devices for Children and Young People. The 2 men went into business together as Elliot and Hornby, selling crude little sets of perforated strips under the name Mechanics Made Easy. At first, they barely sold at all. The trouble was that shopkeepers couldn't see what they were looking at. A box of metal strips and nuts and bolts looked like nothing, like ironmongery, not a toy, nothing a child would want and nothing a parent would buy. So Hornby did something that tells you everything about the salesman hiding inside the bookkeeper. He got hold of a letter of endorsement from Professor Henry Selby Helly Shaw, who held the chair of engineering at University College, Liverpool, and he waved that professor's name in front of sceptical retailers until they understood that this box of bits wasn't a novelty. It was educational, improving, serious. The self-help creed wasn't only in the man. He'd built it into the sales pitch, and it worked. Those first years were leaner than the legend later allowed. Hornby was a man in his late 30s, with a wife and children, gambling a borrowed £5 and his own reputation on a toy nobody had asked for. There were long stretches when the sets sat unsold, when the whole enterprise hung on the willingness of 1 or 2 shopkeepers to give the strange little boxes shelf space. What carried him through was not capital which he barely had, but conviction, the plain, unshakable belief, straight out of Samuel Smiles, that a good thing made well would find its market if only the maker refused to give up on it. He was, in that sense, the perfect founder for the company Meccano would become, certain of his own quality, and prepared to wait for the world to agree with him. It was a magnificent trait. Half a century later, in other men's hands, that same certainty would curdle into something far more costly. And so, the sets sold. Then they sold better. Then they sold faster than the little partnership could make them. By 1907, the product had a proper name, Meccano, trademarked that September, a word that meant nothing and therefore meant only itself. And on the 30th of May, 1908, Frank Hornby formed Meccano Ltd, bought Elliot out entirely, and became sole master of the thing he'd dreamed up in his shed. The bookkeeper was gone. In his place stood a manufacturer with a factory to fill and an idea that the whole of Britain was beginning to want. Chapter 2. The Empire at Binns Road. Everything Meccano would eventually become, the trains, the die-cast cars, the sprawling works, the household names spoken in every front room in the land, began with a building. By September of 1914, with the country tipping into the First World War, Frank Hornby had his purpose-built factory in full production, a great red brick complex on Binns Road in the old Swan district of Liverpool, sprawled across roughly 5 acres of the city. It would remain the beating heart of the enterprise for more than 60 years. When people said Meccano, they meant Binns Road. And when they meant Binns Road, they were already reaching for something larger than a factory, something closer to a legend. By 1928, the works employed more than 1,200 people, and it was still growing. Hornby understood, as very few manufacturers of his era did, that he wasn't only selling a product, he was selling a world and a boy's place inside it. In 1916, he launched Meccano magazine, a publication that would one day reach a circulation of around 50,000 and land on breakfast tables from Liverpool to Lahore. He founded the Meccano Guild, a club with badges and rules in local branches, so that a boy in Bolton and a boy in Bombay could feel they belonged to the very same fraternity of builders. The genius of it was that Meccano was never finished. You bought a starter set, and then you bought the next, and the next, forever chasing the crane or the motorcar pictured on the box you couldn't yet afford. Hornby hadn't just invented a toy, he'd invented an appetite that fed itself. Then, in 1920, came the thing that would one day eclipse everything else he'd made. Meccano launched the Hornby clockwork train, an O-gauge locomotive built, fittingly, from Meccano-style components, sold under the confident slogan, "British and guaranteed." It was a hit almost from the first winter it appeared under the nation's Christmas trees, and it grew and grew until within a decade the trains were outselling Meccano itself. The child had overtaken the parent. In 1925, the firm went electric, though the earlier system was a genuinely alarming affair, sending 110 volts of alternating current through rails that small hands would be touching. That was later, and wisely, corrected to a far safer low-voltage direct current. Frank Hornby, the man who had never been trained in a single day of engineering, was now running one of the most inventive toy companies on earth. And still, he kept inventing. In 1931, the company began producing small die-cast vehicles under the name Hornby Modelled Miniatures, and in 1934 rechristened and relaunched them as Dinky Toys. Those tiny cars and lorries would hand Meccano a near monopoly on the British die-cast toy for more than a decade, and the secret of it lay in the metal, a zinc alloy called Mazak, which Meccano learned to melt and pour and cast with a mastery no rival in Britain could touch. That single skill, the ability to cast small, heavy, exquisitely detailed metal objects at scale, day after day, was about to matter more than anyone at Binns Road could possibly have imagined. It would build them their greatest triumph, and, in time, it would help sink them, and it reached further than Britain. Meccano and Hornby travelled out along the shipping lanes of the Empire into the nurseries of the Dominions and the colonies, so that the same instruction leaflet a boy pored over in Liverpool was pored over by another in Auckland or Toronto or Cape Town. A guild badge meant the same thing in either place. Hornby had built something that behaved less like a manufacturer and more like a movement, and the boys who grew up inside it did not simply own the toys, They belonged to them. That loyalty, freely given and fiercely held, was worth more than any advertising budget. It was also, though nobody could have known it then, the very thing that would make the eventual betrayal of it feel so much like a death in the family. By the 1930s, Frank Hornby was a millionaire. He lived in a mansion called Quarry Brook in Maghull and was driven down to Binns Road each morning by a chauffeur, a Liverpool clerk who had become industrial royalty. In 1931, he was elected Conservative Member of Parliament for Everton, standing down only at the general election of 1935. He had done, quite literally and to the letter, what Samuel Smiles had promised a diligent man could do. The shed had become an empire. He would not live to see its crowning glory. Frank Hornby died on the 21st of September, 1936, of a chronic heart condition complicated by diabetes, and was buried at St Andrew's Church in Maghull, not far from the mansion his toys had bought. And here is the detail that ought to give any storyteller pause, the small, quiet irony sitting right at the centre of the whole story. The train set that would carry his name into the memory of a whole nation, Hornby Dublo, did not yet exist when he died. It was first seriously discussed at a product meeting the following year, in 1937. Frank Hornby never earned a single penny from the most famous product ever to bear his name. He was already in the ground when it was born. Chapter 3. The Rolls-Royce of the Rails. The men who inherited Frank Hornby's company were determined to make something extraordinary, and in 1938 they did. They launched Hornby Dublo. Dublo being a playful shrinking of double O, the smaller OO gauge that would go on to define British model railways for generations. And they built it, quite deliberately, to be the finest table railway that money could buy. Not the cheapest, not the most popular, the finest. Dublo was to be, as the phrase went around Binns Road, the Rolls-Royce of model trains, and everyone who worked on it understood that the comparison was the whole point. You have to understand what that meant once it was in your hand. A Hornby Dublo locomotive wasn't stamped out of thin, hollow tin the way cheaper trains were. It was cast from heavy die-cast alloy, using the very same craft Meccano had perfected making dinky cars. A solid, weighty little engine, with an accurate profile and deep, glossy paintwork, the kind of finish that only came from a company that already knew how to enamel to a jeweller's standard. The launch range led with a modest tank engine, and beside it, as its star, a streamlined locomotive modelled on one of the most beautiful machines Britain has ever built, the London and North Eastern Railway's A4 Pacific, Sir Nigel Gresley, named for the engineer who designed the real thing. A child could hold, on his bedroom floor, a perfect miniature of an engine thundering the East Coast main line. The electric system running underneath was built to exactly the same philosophy, and this is the part of the story worth marking carefully, because it becomes everything later. Dublo used 3 rails, 2 running rails to carry the wheels, and a live third rail down the centre of the track to carry the current. There were good reasons for it. 3 rail was reliable. A locomotive, picking up its power from a centre rail, simply couldn't short out the way a 2-rail engine could, and reversing the train on direct current was beautifully straightforward. The track itself was drawn brass laid on a pressed metal base, so robust it was fairly described as practically indestructible. Even the points, the little sections that switched a train from one line to another, were over-engineered to a degree that bordered on the comical. It was said that when you opened their boxes, they almost looked like pieces of jewellery. This was the Meccano creed made physical. Build it heavier, build it better, build it to outlast the child who owned it. And it was, without argument, magnificent. There's a small heartbreak folded into the timing of it all. In 1939, Hornby announced a premium set built around a locomotive named the Duchess of Atholl, a train advertised, admired, and longed for across the country. And then the war came, and it simply could not be made. Binns Road was ordered over to war work. By 1943, toy production had ceased entirely. The presses turned to the business of survival. The Duchess that boys had been promised in 1939 did not actually reach them until 1948, the better part of a decade between the promise and the parcel. A whole childhood could pass in a gap like that. The relaunched Dublo of the early 50s was, if anything, more desirable than what had gone before. The catalogues returned, thick with locomotives and coaches and lineside buildings, each item rendered in colour and priced to signal that this was the good stuff, the range a serious boy aspired to. and it sold on its reputation as much as its detail. A parent buying a Hornby Dublo set knew, or believed he knew, that he was buying something that would survive being dropped, trodden on, left out in the cold of an unheated bedroom, and handed down to a younger brother, still running true. That reputation for indestructibility had been earned across 2 decades and a world war, and it was, at this moment, the most valuable thing the company owned. More valuable, perhaps, than the machines that made the trains. The war treated Meccano more kindly than it treated a great many British firms. Liverpool was bombed savagely in the Blitz, the docks and streets around Binns Road battered night after night. And yet the factory itself came through undamaged. Its machines turned to munitions and precision war work instead of trains. Some of Meccano's old rivals were not so fortunate across the centuries' upheavals. The German firm Bing, which had actually pioneered a half-size table railway back in the 1920s, had long since collapsed. Meccano endured. But peace brought frustrations of its own. Metal was rationed and desperately scarce, and the situation grew worse still when the Korean War, from 1950, choked off the very supply of zinc that Dublo's die-cast bodies depended upon. New Dublo locomotives did not return in real numbers until the early 1950s. When they finally did, clockwork was quietly retired for good. From now on, Hornby Dublo would run on electricity alone, and it would run more beautifully than anything else on the market. The company had survived the Great Depression, the Blitz, and the long grey years of rationing. It stood, in the early 50s, at the very threshold of its golden age. Chapter 4. 30 Women on a Line. Imagine arriving for your first shift at Binns Road in the middle of the 1950s. You'd come in through the gates off Binns Road into a world that ran to its own rhythm. A great sprawl of pitched roof workshops where, at the peak, something close to 2,000 people made toys for the children of the world. And the first thing you'd notice, once you were properly inside, is that most of the faces around you belonged to women. Around 80% of the Binns Road workforce was female, arranged along assembly lines that were pitched in open competition against one another for output and for pride. 30 women on a line, and each line racing the others, the whole floor alive with a quiet, relentless contest to be the fastest and the finest. You'd hear the place before you understood it. The steady thump of the pressing machines, the hiss and clatter of metal moving through the shop, and beneath all of it a low, continuous hum that never entirely stopped, the sound a working factory makes when several hundred people and their machines are all in motion at once. And you'd smell it too, the hot, sharp tang of molten metal drifting from the casting shop, and threading through it the heady chemical sweetness of enamel paint, the 2 scents that would come to mean work for the rest of your life. The day itself had a shape you could set your life by. The works hooter marked the shifts, and for the streets around Old Swan it was a kind of clock, the sound that emptied the houses in the morning and filled them again at night. There was a canteen where the tea urns ran all day and the fried breakfast went out to the early shift. There were friendships that lasted decades, courtships that began across a bench and ended in marriage, whole social lives that orbited the works. And on a Friday, there was the wage packet, the small brown envelope, its weight familiar in the hand, that turned a week of pressing metal and spraying enamel into rent paid and children fed and, now and then, a Dublo engine for a birthday. The toys these women built for other people's children helped buy the toys their own children opened. There was a quiet symmetry in that which nobody remarked on, because it was simply the way things were. The heart of the whole operation, the very source of Dublo's magic, was the die-casting shop, where molten Mazak zinc alloy ran hot and bright and was poured into moulds to make the heavy little locomotive bodies. There was a folk practice on that floor, half tradition and half plain carelessness, of throwing scrap metal, and even the foil from cigarette packets, into the molten vats to be melted down again. It seemed harmless enough. It wasn't. That contamination was later blamed for the crumbling zinc pest that afflicted some of the company's pre-war castings, a slow structural fatigue that could turn a solid metal engine into powder in a collector's cabinet decades on. Even the finest craft, it turned out, carried its own hidden flaws, a fault poured invisibly into the metal at the very moment of its making. From the casting shop, a bare body would travel on to the paint and spray sheds, where workers wielded aerograph spray guns to lay down the deep, glossy liveries that made a Dublo engine look less like a plaything and more like a shrunken version of the real thing. This was the dinky expertise, repaid with interest. Decades of learning how to finish small metal objects to perfection, poured now into locomotives that gleamed on the shelf. A boy tearing the paper off one on Christmas morning held in his hands the accumulated skill of hundreds of Liverpool hands he would never meet and never think to thank. And here is a warning that most of the men and women on that floor would never have registered, because it looked like nothing more sinister than continuity, than doing things properly. By the 1950s, some of the pressing machines still thumping away at Binns Road dated back to around 1910, nearly half a century old. One observer later likened the place to a museum of industrial archaeology and meant it partly as praise because the old machines still worked and the products they turned out were superb. But a factory that treasures its ancient machinery is a factory that has quietly stopped asking whether the world outside its gates has moved on without it. The presses were faithful. That was exactly the trouble. For thousands of Liverpool families, none of that mattered in the slightest. Binns Road was simply where you worked, where your father had worked, and where your own children would work in their turn. Take the Wilde family. One thread among hundreds, but a real one. James Wilde served as a steel tool treater right up until 1953. Albert Wilde became foreman of the Meccano department that same year on a salary of £675 a year, a solid, respectable wage that measured out a solid, respectable life. And Peter Wilde worked as a toolmaker, one of the skilled men who cut the dies from which everything else in the whole factory flowed. There's a lovely telling detail buried in Peter Wilde's story. He would bring home pre-production toys for his own sons to test, so that a new Hornby product might be tried out on a Liverpool kitchen floor before the country ever laid eyes on it. 3 generations of one family, their working lives braided into the same red brick works. Now multiply that by hundreds, and you begin to grasp what Binns Road actually was. Not a factory, a community that happened to have a roof over it. Chapter 5. The finest table railway in the world. By the early 1950s, Meccano wasn't merely successful. It was, by common consent across the hobby, the best in the world at what it did, and, crucially, it knew it. Hornby Dublo was widely regarded as the finest table railway on the planet, and the claim was not idle boasting. Those heavy die-cast body shells did something genuinely clever. Their sheer weight pressed the driving wheels down hard onto the rails and gave the locomotives real, dependable grip, hauling long trains where lighter engines would spin and stall. The shapes were accurate, the paintwork was superb, and technically, Dublo was ahead of its rivals, in ways the enthusiasts prized even where the children never noticed. It ran on finer scale wheels and on direct current, a clear step more sophisticated than the alternating current system of its chief rival, Trix. Meccano's own catalogue described Dublo as representing the highest degree of realism ever attained in gauge 00. For once, the marketing barely stretched the truth. The numbers tell you how completely Britain's boys had taken it to their hearts. The standard 264 tank engine, introduced in 1954, went on to sell more than 100,000 units. A single locomotive in 100,000 homes, on 100,000 hearthrugs. Because that is what a Hornby Dublo set was for a boy of that era. The aspirational Christmas gift. The very thing you wrote to Father Christmas about and dared not quite believe you'd get. The oval of track laid out around the base of the tree. Or, for the lucky ones, a permanent layout built up on a board in the loft or the spare room. Expanded piece by piece with birthday money and saved up pocket money. A siding here, a signal box there, a second engine the following Christmas. The loco lifted warm from the rails after a long run, the transformer humming on the floor. It was a whole imaginative universe, and it arrived in a cardboard box. And what those boys were buying, when they finally got their engine, was a little piece of the nation's own romance with the railway. Hornby Dublo modelled the great-named locomotives that hauled the crack expresses of the age, the streamlined giants of the main lines, the engines whose names schoolboys knew the way they knew footballers. To run one across your bedroom floor was to command, in miniature, the same machine that thundered through your local station too fast to read. That was the deal Dublo offered, and no plastic upstart could yet match the weight and gleam of it. A boy would press his nose to the toy shop window through the long grey autumn, saving, calculating, wanting, and the wanting was half the pleasure. Meccano understood that wanting better than anyone alive. They had, after all, been cultivating it since 1916. And around that universe, Meccano had built an entire civic architecture of belonging. There was the Meccano magazine, edited for years by Ellison Hawkes, dropping through the letterbox each month. Some accounts put its peak circulation as high as 70,000 back in the 1930s, others nearer 50,000. But either way, it was read in numbers most magazines would envy today. There was the Meccano Guild, the Hornby Railway Company for the train owners, the Dinky Toys Club, even a Hornby Speedboat Club, each with its own badges, its own literature, its own local network stitching enthusiasts together across the country. To be a Hornby boy was to hold membership in something larger than yourself. It gave Binns Road a status that bordered on the mythical, a sense that this Liverpool works wasn't a mere supplier of playthings, but a kind of national institution, a permanent fixture, a guarantor of British quality that would surely stand forever. That was precisely the belief that would prove so quietly, so terribly dangerous. Because the company had come to regard its own superiority as a simple law of nature, as fixed as the tides. Its products were better, heavier, finer, more real, more lovingly made, and the men who ran Meccano were serenely certain that British parents and British boys would always understand the difference and would always be willing to pay the premium for it. Higher prices weren't a barrier to sales in this way of thinking. They were proof of quality. Quality had always won. It would go on winning, wouldn't it? Because it always had. That certainty was Meccano's crown. In a few short years, it would prove to be the thing it wore to its own funeral. Chapter 6. The summit. The peak, when it came, was the first half of the 1950s. Production had climbed all the way back to full capacity after the lean, rationed post-war years. Train sets were flying off the shelves as fast as Binns Road could pack them. Hornby Dublo stood unrivaled and unquestioned. The finest table railway in the world, made in Liverpool, sold across the empire, beloved by an entire generation of boys who would remember it, warmly and precisely, for the rest of their lives. If you had walked into Binns Road in 1953 and told the men in charge that within 11 years the company would be bankrupt and sold off to a competitor they barely troubled to take seriously, they would not have believed a word of it. And on the evidence in front of them, they'd have been right not to. Everything they could see, in every direction, said they had won. But that is the treacherous thing about a summit. It is the one place from which every direction leads downward. And even as Meccano stood on its peak, savouring the view it had earned across half a century, the ground was already shifting beneath a rival's feet a few hundred miles to the south. The rival was Triang. Its model railway arm had grown out of a modest little commission in 1950, a cheap plastic train set made for Marks and Spencer to sell at Christmas, and it was driven forward with real vision by a man named Richard Lynes, of the family whose three brothers, William, Walter and Arthur, had founded the whole toy empire on a pun. 3 lines make a triangle. In 1954, Triang opened a brand new, purpose-built, ruthlessly efficient factory at Margate in Kent. Not a museum of machinery inherited from 1910. A modern plant, built from the ground up for a modern method, cheap plastic injection moulding, and designed to churn out train sets faster and cheaper than heavy die-cast metal could ever hope to match. Plastic could be improved endlessly and kept cheap. Cast metal was, by its very nature, expensive to make. The two approaches were about to be set against each other in the toy shops of Britain, and only one of them could win on price. There was an early warning too, had anyone at Binns Road cared to read it. Triang had launched its trains in 1952, dressed in the liveries of the newly nationalised British Railways, the fresh colours that boys actually saw pulling into their local station. Hornby Dublo, for all its die-cast splendour, didn't switch across to British Railways liveries until 1953, a whole year behind. It was a small thing, in itself, a matter of paint, of catalogue timing, but it was the first faint sign that the finest table railway in the world was, in this one small respect, no longer the quickest to give the customer exactly what he wanted. Nobody inside those walls could see the cliff. From the summit, wrapped in the warm and wholly earned certainty of being the best, the view was of clear sky in every direction. The fall, when it began, would begin with a question. A question the men at Binns Road were absolutely sure they already knew the answer to. A question about 2 rails or 3. Chapter 7. 2 rails or 3. There was a question sitting quietly underneath the whole business, and it came down to a single rail. Hornby Dublo ran on 3 of them, 2 to carry the wheels, and a live one down the middle to carry the current. It was a good system, and Meccano had chosen it for good reasons. A locomotive drawing power from a centre rail simply couldn't short out. Reversing was clean and simple. The track was robust enough to survive a decade of children. 3-rail was reliable, and reliability had been the Meccano religion since Frank Hornby first bolted 2 strips together. But the world was changing its mind about what a model railway was for. As the hobby matured, it reached for realism above all, and nothing shattered the illusion of a real railway, quite like an ugly 3rd rail running down the centre of the track, a thing no real railway had ever had. The serious modeller wanted his miniature world to look like the real one, right down to the ballast between the sleepers, and a great brass rail humming down the middle of it was an insult to the whole idea. 2-rail, using the running rails themselves to carry the current, looked like the real thing. And here was the part that mattered most. 2-rail suited cheap plastic construction where heavy die-cast metal did not. Realism and cheapness arriving together, pulling in the same direction. Against that, 3 rails of drawn brass had no answer at all. The man who saw it first wasn't at Binns Road. He was a designer called Alexander Gregory Venetian, whose small firm, Rovex Plastics, had been founded in 1946 and made toys for Marks & Spencer. And it was Marks & Spencer who set the whole thing in motion. For Christmas of 1950, the retailer wanted an affordable train set to put in front of ordinary families, and Venetian gave them one. A plastic locomotive named the Princess, moulded in cellulose acetate, cheap and cheerful and good enough. It went on sale at around £2, 17 shillings and 6pence. That was roughly half the price of anything comparable. Half. Think of what that meant across a nation of front rooms on Christmas morning. A parent who simply wanted a train under the tree, not the Rolls-Royce, just a train that ran and pleased a child, now had a choice that Meccano had never once had to worry about in 50 years. And a great many parents, that Christmas and every Christmas after, made it. Rovex, short of money, was swallowed the following year by the toy giant Lines Brothers, the makers of Triang, renamed Rovex Scale Models, and moved into that gleaming new Margate factory in 1954. And so the plastic train, the cheap, realistic upstart, now had the muscle of one of the biggest toy firms in Britain behind it, driven by Richard Lines, with a clear sight of exactly where the market was heading. Others were circling too. Trix, Playcraft, the track makers, G and R Wren. But it was Triang that carried the threat, because Triang had understood the one thing Meccano had decided not to believe, that plastic injection moulding was cheaper, that it could be improved endlessly, and that it was becoming, year by year, good enough. It's worth being precise about why plastic won, because it wasn't a matter of taste, it was a matter of arithmetic. Injection moulding worked like this. You paid an enormous sum once to cut the steel mould, and after that, every copy that squirted out of it cost almost nothing. The more you made, the cheaper each one became, and you could tweak and refine the mould endlessly to add detail the customer would notice. Die casting was the opposite kind of economics. Every heavy metal engine devoured expensive zinc alloy, took time and skilled hands to cast and fettle and finish, and cost roughly the same to make whether you built 100 or 100,000. One method got cheaper as it grew, the other never really did. Meccano wasn't just up against a cheaper product, it was up against a cheaper way of making things, and no amount of craftsmanship could outrun that. Set the prices side by side and the gap was stark, even allowing that they were never quite a like-for-like comparison across the same year. The premium Hornby Dublo Duchess of Atholl set had been listed at around 92 shillings and 6pence, £4, 12 shillings and 6pence, while Triang's plastic sets came in at a fraction of that. Hornby Dublo was, without argument, far superior. It was also, without argument, far more expensive. It became the train of the more affluent household, the aspirational gift, while the family that just wanted to see a child's face light up on Christmas morning increasingly reached for the cheaper box. Superior was no longer the same thing as successful. That was the crack in the ground, and it was widening. Nor was it only the trains. The whole of Meccano was quietly slipping. The construction sets that had made Frank Hornby's name were being overtaken by cheaper, more modern rivals. And Dinky, the die-cast jewel in the crown, the near monopoly Meccano had enjoyed for 2 decades, suddenly had company. In 1956, a new firm called Corgi arrived with a single, deceptively small innovation: windows. Clear plastic windows in its little cars, where Dinky's had only blank painted metal. It sounds like nothing. To a child holding both, it was everything. One car you could see into, imagine yourself driving, and one you couldn't. Corgi called itself, without embarrassment, the one with windows, and it stole ground fast. Behind it came Lesnie's Matchbox, tiny cars small enough and cheap enough to buy with loose change, and Triang's own Spot On. On every front, at once, someone cheaper or cleverer or hungrier had appeared. The empire that had felt permanent for 50 years was being nibbled away at its every edge, and the nibbling was accelerating. And the men at the top were not the men who had built it. When Frank Hornby died in 1936, his son Roland Hornby took the chair, and a capable executive named George Jones became managing director. Jones was a marketing man to his bones. He understood the customer, he understood the market, and Hornby Dublo itself had been one of his triumphs. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man a company needs when the ground beneath it is starting to move. But Jones died in office, and the role passed to a man named Beardsley, who had risen through production. A fine production man, by all accounts, someone who knew how a thing was made. But knowing how a thing is made is not the same as knowing whether anyone still wants to buy it. By every account, Beardsley did not have Jones's instinct for the market, and so a company about to fight a marketing war had just lost, at the very worst moment, its best marketing mind, replacing it with a man whose gifts lay in the one area where Meccano was already strong, and leaving unguarded the one area where it was about to be overrun. Chapter 8. The faith kept too long. Here is where the tragedy properly begins, and it begins not with stupidity, but with pride. The honest, understandable pride of people who had genuinely built the best. The first decision was to do nothing. Through the 1950s, as Triang embraced two-rail from the very start, Meccano kept faith with 3. And you can follow the logic all the way down, because it was not mad. Meccano had an enormous installed base, hundreds of thousands of boys with 3-rail track already laid in their lofts and their box rooms, boys who would need new engines and new coaches for years to come, and who would need them all to run on the track they already owned. Abandon 3-rail, and you abandoned every one of those loyal customers overnight. The company felt a genuine duty to them. You can almost hear the argument in the boardroom. We don't leave our customers stranded. We don't chase fashion. We make the best, and we stand by it. And underneath the duty sat the deeper faith, that Meccano's bomb-proof quality would carry the day no matter what plastic novelty the competition dreamed up, because it always had. The trouble was that while Meccano stood still out of loyalty and pride, the market simply walked past it. Year by year, the die-cast range that had once been the most modern thing on any shelf began quietly to look old-fashioned. The realism gap widened. New boys with no 3-rail track to be loyal to, looked at the two systems and chose the one that looked real and cost less. And the men at Binns Road, secure in the knowledge that they made the finest table railway in the world, mistook standing still for holding firm. There is a terrible difference between the two, and by the time it became visible from the boardroom, years had gone. There was, in the record, a documented streak of something harder than pride running through the firm, a settled belief that Meccano's products existed on an altogether higher plane than their rivals, and that their long reputation and superior quality would simply be enough to carry them through. The high prices weren't seen as a problem. They were seen as proof. A costly train was a good train, and a good train would always sell, because it always had. It was a belief that had been true for 50 years. It was about to stop being true, and nobody at the top could quite bring themselves to see it. By the time they did move, it was 1959, and the move made everything worse. Meccano finally launched a 2-rail Dublo system, but rather than abandon its 3-rail customers, it chose to make both at once, and that single choice doubled the size of the problem. Because the two systems weren't compatible, Meccano now had to tool up and produce 2 versions of practically every locomotive it made. 2 of everything. The costs didn't rise. They multiplied. Think about what that meant on the factory floor. Every engine now needed 2 sets of components, 2 production runs, 2 stock lines in the warehouse, 2 entries in the catalogue, a 3-rail version for the Old Faithful, a 2-rail version for the New World, and Meccano was carrying the full cost of both, while its rival carried the cost of only one. Triang built 2-rail and only 2-rail in a modern factory designed to do exactly that. Meccano built everything, twice, in a factory full of machines, older than the men operating them. It was trying to serve its past and its future at the same time, and paying double for the privilege, at the precise moment it could least afford to pay anything at all. And the new 2-rail range, when it arrived, was troubled from the start. The chief draftsman was a dedicated scale modeler, a man who cared about accuracy, and the new nickel-silver track he designed was arguably too fine, too delicate, for the rough handling of an actual child on an actual bedroom floor. Worse were the points, the little switches that sent a train from one line to another. Meccano's new live frog points demanded fiddly, complicated wiring to work properly. Triang and Playcraft offered simpler points a boy could just plug in and run, no wiring required. Picture the father at the toy shop counter, weighing the two. One system was cheaper, simpler, more forgiving, and looked just as real. The other was dearer, trickier, more fragile, and carried a name from before the war. He made the sensible choice. Thousands of fathers made the same sensible choice. The verdict of the historians is quiet and devastating. The policy of keeping faith with the old 3-rail users while launching the new 2-rail system was a mistake that cost the company dearly. Meccano had waited too long to change, and then changed in the most expensive way it possibly could. There was a deeper problem underneath all of it, and it lived in the boardroom rather than the factory. Meccano had come to treat its own high prices as a virtue, proof that a Hornby product was worth more, not a reason a family might buy something else. Inside a company that had been right about that for half a century, the idea had hardened into something close to doctrine. Beardsley, the production man now running the firm without George Jones's feel for the customer, presided over a culture that could not quite believe the customer had changed. When the sales figures said otherwise, the instinct was not to cut the price, but to trust the reputation. It was the confidence of the champion who has never lost, walking into the ring one fight too many. The high prices held out of the same old conviction that they signalled quality rather than deterred buyers, even as the costs of tooling all that new plastic super detail rolling stock piled higher, and the company kept reaching for the next thing and missing it. It built a range of tiny die-cast vehicles designed to run alongside the trains, lovely little things, beautifully cast, exactly what Meccano did best. But against Matchbox's juggernaut, they were a sideline, a nice idea arriving into a market someone else already owned. Then came the slot racing car craze, the great new obsession of British boyhood, electric cars whipping around a track at the squeeze of a trigger. Meccano missed it almost entirely, arriving late and half-hearted with a French-made system, while Triang's own Scalextric and the rising Airfix cleaned up the very craze Meccano should have been built to win. Here was a company that could cast and wire and finish small-powered vehicles better than almost anyone alive, watching from the sidelines as others made a fortune doing exactly that. Every instinct that had served Meccano so faithfully in the age of metal now betrayed it, one by one, in the age of plastic. The strengths had become the weaknesses. The very things it was best at were the things the market had stopped rewarding. At last, far too late, the company tried to cut its way out. It began making more plastic-bodied pieces of its own, the very material it had disdained. It launched cheap, ready-to-run starter sets, one advertised at 89 shillings and sixpence in the spring of 1963, in a belated attempt to meet Triang somewhere near its price. But you cannot turn a great heavy ship in a harbour this small. The firm was overstaffed, carrying more hands than its shrinking sails could justify. It was wedded to methods and machines from before the First World War, some of the presses nearing half a century old, and it was instinctively, culturally distrustful of the very materials and methods that were beating it, a place where "we've always done it this way" had once been a boast and had quietly become a sentence of death. The reforms came. Some were sound. They simply came too late and too slowly to matter. Roland Hornby's company had spent its reputation over a decade of standing still, and reputation, it turns out, cannot be reinvested once it's gone. It can only be watched from the boardroom window as it walks out of the toy shop in someone else's carrier bag. Chapter 9. The Silence at Binns Road. By the early 1960s, the numbers had stopped adding up. Meccano Ltd was in serious financial trouble, this despite exports still worth more than £1 million a year. That's the cruel part. Money was still coming in. The name still meant something in 100 countries. Orders still arrived. But the money was going out faster than it came, and no amount of overseas goodwill could plug a hole that had been opening for a decade. The costs had simply become impossible. 2 railway systems made twice over, a factory overstaffed and running on machinery from before the First World War, warehouses of unsold premium stock, a firm still paying to be the best in a market that had decided it wanted cheap. The great warehouse at Binns Road told the story better than any ledger. Because by now, Hornby Dublo production had already been stopped. The unsold train sets were stacking up, boxes upon boxes, the finest table railways in the world with nobody left to buy them at the price they cost to make. Understand what that means. It's often said that Triang killed Hornby Dublo. It didn't, quite. Meccano stopped making Dublo itself because it could no longer sell what it made. The company had, in effect, already surrendered before the buyer arrived. Walk that warehouse in your mind. Row upon row of the finest table railways in the world. The heavy die-cast locomotives, the jewel-like points, the deep glossy liveries sprayed by hands that had spent their lives learning how, boxed, stacked, and going nowhere. Every one of them a small masterpiece. Every one of them costing more to make than anyone would now pay. That was the shape of the trap Meccano had walked into. Not that its trains were bad, but that they were too good, too dear, too slow, and too many. Quality, unsold, is just money sitting on a shelf. And so the board did the only thing left to do. They invited Lines Brothers, Triang, the very rival that had beaten them, to come and buy the company. Sit with the shape of that. Not a merger of equals, not a rescue by a friend. Meccano, the firm that had been so certain its quality would always win, so certain it need not stoop to compete on price, now going cap in hand to the plastic upstart it had watched rise. The champion asking the challenger to take the title off its hands because it could no longer afford to hold it. On the 14th of February, 1964, Lines purchased the full share capital of Meccano Ltd for £781,000, the British factory, the French one too, the trademark, the trains, the whole of Frank Hornby's empire sold to the firm that had undone it for a sum that would barely buy a decent house today. 56 years that empire had stood, from a shed on Copper's Hill to the finest railway in the world, and it changed hands in a single afternoon of signatures for a number a good footballer now earns in a season. The new owners moved quickly. Sweeping changes came, and among them, the last members of the Hornby family were removed from office altogether. Roland Hornby, Frank's son, and the rest of them, gone. The name over the door survived. The family behind it did not. After more than half a century, there was no longer a Hornby anywhere near Hornby. In 1965, the ranges were merged under a new banner, Triang Hornby. It sounded like a marriage. It was closer to a burial. Because the trains that would now carry the Hornby name were not Hornby trains at all. They were Triang's plastic Rovex models, wearing a borrowed surname. The engineering that Frank Hornby's company had spent 40 years perfecting owed almost nothing to what came next, and almost everything to the rival it had lost to. There is a particular cruelty in that. The name lived. The thing the name stood for did not. A boy buying a Hornby train after 1965 was buying Triang plastic with an old word printed on the box. The heavy die-cast engine, warm from a long run, the jewel-like points, the drawn brass rail, all of it was already becoming a memory, a thing that fathers would one day describe to sons who'd never hold it. The victor had simply absorbed the vanquished, kept the famous name because it was worth keeping, and quietly let everything behind the name dissolve. Hornby Dublo, the real thing, the heavy die-cast Rolls-Royce of the rails, formally ended in December of 1964. The very last item believed to have come off the line was a humble track-cleaning wagon, thought to be the smallest production run in the whole history of Dublo. A cleaning wagon. The final act of the finest railway in the world was a little vehicle whose only job was to wipe the track clean behind everything that had gone before. There could hardly be a sadder full stop. The thing that swept up after the trains was itself the last train. The tooling, the precious dies that shaped those beautiful engines, was sold on to another Lines Brothers firm, G&R Wren, down in Basildon in Essex. And there, from 1967, the old Dublo locomotives were made again, under new names, using methods and equipment in some cases identical to the original pre-war Hornby Dublo ways. There is something almost haunting in that. The craft didn't die at Binns Road. It was packed into crates and driven the better part of 300 miles south, to be practiced by other hands, in another county under someone else's badge. The same dies, the same weight of metal, the same over-engineered beauty, just no longer in Liverpool, and no longer Hornby. Wren kept the old craft alive until its own plant finally closed in 1992, a long, quiet afterlife for the work that Liverpool had invented and could no longer afford to do. But Liverpool itself still had one shift left to lose, because the factory on Binns Road did not close in 1964. It kept going under its new owners, making Meccano and Dinky. The gates stayed open. The hooter still sounded. The women still came in on the morning shift. For 15 more years, the works that Frank Hornby built kept working. The trains gone, the family gone, the great days gone, but the place itself still standing, still employing, still alive. Its ending, when it finally came, would be the cruelest part of the whole story. Chapter 10. The 15 minutes. The end took a long time arriving, and then arrived in a quarter of an hour. Lines Brothers itself collapsed in 1971, reporting a loss of around £4.5 million, the rival that had won turning out to be mortal after all. Its model division was broken up and passed along, and the Hornby Railway brand became Hornby Railways in 1972, drifting on through new corporate hands. And the Meccano assets, the Liverpool works itself, ended up with the model kit firm Airfix, which brings us to a Friday. The 30th of November, 1979. By most accounts, the workers at Binns Road were given something like 15 minutes' notice. Some remembered 20. They were gathered into the canteen, the same canteen where the tea urns had run all day for 65 years, and told the factory was closing for good. Immediately, around 950 people, weeks before Christmas, learning in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea, that the work was over. One foreman's own note recorded it with the flat disbelief of a man watching the impossible happen. They had everyone in the canteen at 4:10, he wrote, and were told the factory would close for good at 4:30. The managing director, a man named Ray McNeice, put it plainly. "We have run out of money," he said. "It's as simple as that." They had hoped for more money from Airfix, and had known only the previous afternoon that it wasn't coming. The company reached for the oldest explanation of all, and blamed the workers, spoke of a workforce that had become almost unmanageable, of pilfering and absenteeism and restrictive practices. A public relations man told a national newspaper that the factory showed exactly why Merseyside was being hollowed out, and was branded a paid assassin for his trouble by the local union officials. But the judgment of history has been steadier and colder than any of that. The real cause was not the workforce. It was the long failure over decades to modernise, the same failure that had let a plastic train set beat the finest metal one in the world. The women would not go quietly. What followed was a factory occupation that lasted 4 months, sustained above all by the women who had built the place, the same lines of workers who had once raced each other for pride, now holding the works against its own owners. Management cut the lights. The workers brought torches. Management cut the heat and the telephones. The workers brought heaters and a generator, and they stayed. There was even talk, for a while, of the workers taking the place over and running it themselves as a cooperative. A man named Jack Spriggs, who had been a worker director at another Merseyside firm that tried exactly that, came and addressed a mass meeting about the possibility. It was a slender hope, but it was hope, and it was theirs. Even Margaret Thatcher's government warned that Airfix could face prosecution for failing to give the 90 days' notice the law required. It was not, in the end, enough. In March of 1980, under a High Court order, bailiffs and some 30 police forced their way in, and the occupation was over. A television documentary recorded the whole sorry business under a title that said everything: "The game is over." And then Binns Road fell silent. That particular silence a place built for noise takes on when the noise finally stops. the wrong kind of quiet in a building that had hummed for 65 years. Most of the workers were made redundant in the last weeks before Christmas. Many waited months for the money they were owed. A hardship fund was set up for those who couldn't. The foreman, Albert Wilde, who had run the Meccano department since 1953, had been planning to retire to North Wales. His relative Peter Wilde, the toolmaker who'd once brought pre-production toys home for his sons to test, found new work over on the Wirral and died young. 3 generations of one family, and the works that had held them all now holding nobody. That was the true cost, the one that never showed in any ledger. Not the trademark, not the tooling, not the £781,000. It was the streets around Old Swan going quiet on a weekday morning. It was skilled hands, hands that had spent decades learning to cast and spray and fettle metal to a standard the world admired, with nowhere left to practice the only trade they knew. When a works like Binns Road dies, it doesn't just take the jobs. It takes the knowledge in those hands and the community that grew up around the sound of the hooter, and it doesn't give any of it back. The building came down fast. Most of the great complex was demolished by the end of 1980. In 1989, the site was sold and the last of it cleared. Today, where the finest table railway in the world was made, there is a car park. There is no memorial. There is no plaque. Someone who wants to stand on the spot has to guess at where it was. Only the Old Works pub, the Railway Hotel, still stands nearby, a survivor with a fitting name. And Meccano itself, the toy Frank Hornby patented for £5 borrowed, went on being made in France, in Calais, changing hands down the years until the world's last dedicated Meccano factory announced its own closure in 2023. Chapter 11. What the name keeps. So did Hornby die? It's a stranger question than it looks. The company Frank Hornby built, Meccano Ltd of Binns Road, Liverpool, is gone and has been for a long time. It died in 1964, sold to the rival it had lost to, and the works that carried its people died in 1979 in the space of 15 minutes in a canteen. That much is simply true. And yet the word Hornby is still on the shelves. Hornby Railways won its independence back in the 1980s, a management buyout in 1981, a public listing in 1986, moved its production to China at the end of the century, and trades today as Hornby Hobbies from Margate in Kent. It's a survivor, and a proud one. It now owns Scalextric and Airfix and Corgi and much else besides, many of the very names from this story, gathered under one roof at last. But here is the quiet truth at the heart of it. That Margate company sits in the old Triang factory. Its trains are descended from Triang's plastic Rovex models, the cheap, realistic upstarts that won the war. They owe almost nothing to Hornby Dublo, and almost everything to the rival that beat it. The name survived. What the name once meant did not. The finest die-cast railway in the world lives on now only in glass cabinets, cared for by the collectors of the Hornby Railway Collectors Association, founded in 1969 and still thousands strong. The country never quite forgot. In February of 2025, the Royal Mail issued a set of 12 stamps celebrating Hornby model railways, the little trains that had run around a nation's Christmas trees, honoured at last on the nation's post. It's a lovely tribute. It is also, if you know the whole story, a quiet monument to a place that no longer exists, made by a company descended from the one that unmade it. Frank Hornby believed to the end that a good thing made well would always find its market. He was right. For 50 years, he built a toy that taught a generation how the world was put together, and a train that a boy at 80 will still tell you he remembers the exact weight of, warm in his hand, on a Christmas morning before the war. What undid it all wasn't one arrogant mistake, whatever the story is usually told to be. It was a refusal to change, held a few years too long by good people who had simply been proved right for too long to imagine ever being wrong. The trains still run, in lofts and on kitchen tables, wherever a heavy die-cast engine has been kept and cared for. But the hooter is gone from Binns Road. The lines of women are gone. The car park sits where the casting shop stood, and no sign tells anyone why. You could stand there on a wet Liverpool afternoon and never know that this, right here, was where the finest table railway in the world was made, and lost.